Without much further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker of the evening, Bryan Cunningham, Executive Director of Cybersecurity Policy and Research Institute at UCI. He's got a long list of impressive credentials, and I'll let him explain more about his background and what he brings to the table in terms of his knowledge and expertise in cybersecurity. Slides up here. There we go. So, Bryan.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for having me. Probably the quickest and easiest thing, and the thing that would make my faculty colleagues at UCI most happy, is for me to explain to you, first of all, what I'm not. As they point at me every day, I'm not a faculty member, I'm not a computer scientist, and I'm not an engineer. They have reminded me of that slightly less since I brought in a major grant to the school, but they still remind me of it quite frequently. I am an intelligence officer and a lawyer by training. I was a CIA officer for 15 years. My last job in government was I was Condi Rice's lawyer when she was a national security advisor. And as part of that, I was one of the authors of the first national strategy to secure cyberspace under President Bush. And in these days of partisanship, I'm happy to say that if you ran an analysis of our national strategy to secure cyberspace and President Obama's 8 years later, they're 80% word for word the same. So that either means we were all very smart or we were all very stupid, but at least we all came to the same conclusions. And so when I left the White House in 2004, I wanted to practice cybersecurity law. Problem was there was no such thing as cybersecurity law. So I went and did a bunch of research, and I created a business plan, and I presented it to big law firms that I'd worked for, and they all said, no, this is not going to last, we don't want to invest in that. And also I wanted to do things on a fixed fee basis, and they wanted to charge $1,000 an hour. Am I not on?
The microphone on the podium is, you're on that microphone. Unfortunately.
Oh, I need both?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, well, I'm going to repeat everything I just said one more time. I'm actually not going to do that. So anyway, long story short, I practiced cybersecurity and privacy law for about 15 years. I still practice it. And in 2016, UCI decided to stand up a Cybersecurity Policy and Research Institute and recruited me to be their founding executive director. Now, at this point, I had absolutely no experience in academia whatsoever, except for 3 tortured years at the University of Virginia Law School. So I didn't know what to expect, but I knew that my father had been an academic before he went into the ministry. True story. He died in 1999, so I never got to ask him why he made the switch, but I 100% understand it now after having spent 3 years in the University of California system. First of all, God's timetable is actually faster than academia. And secondly, God's commands are easier to understand. But we're plowing away. We had a major event, research symposium yesterday. This will be available on our website through video at cpri.uci.edu in about a week. Some very enlightening research findings that probably will not surprise you as engineers as much as it surprised me as a layman, but one of them was, and this paper is about to be published in a week or so, there are relatively simple ways to turn a hard drive inside a computer into a listening device. And so, yeah, right? That's what I said too. Even though most of us, at least lay people, believe that this is not possible, it turns out if you can determine the right frequency and you can push the right wave in there, you can actually trigger the conversion of a hard drive into a listening device. And if you don't believe me, that's even better than if you do believe me, because then you watch the video, which is going to be on our website in about a week. So I speak often on cybersecurity, and one of the blessings and curses of being in this business is that no matter where I speak, no matter when I speak, within the last week, there are always some very interesting / terrifying things that have happened. So I just did a little check on the way over, and it turns out, first of all, hours ago, as you probably, many of you probably know, President Trump issued an executive order invoking the Emergency Powers Act and banning Huawei and DTE from selling into the U.S. telecommunications 5G development process. We'll see how that shakes out. We'll see if it was a bluff or not. We'll see if it gets litigated. But as of right now, they are, in fact, banned. Within the last week, it was revealed that hackers had successfully attacked a United States power grid. Now, they didn't actually get to the point where they were able to or wanted to redistribute power or shut anything down, but DHS has confirmed that they did successfully break in. We've known for years that the Russians and the Iranians and the Chinese and others had put code inside our power grid, and apparently now one of them decided to test that. The city of Baltimore, a few days ago, was completely shut down. They had to take all of their services offline, including emergency services, based on a ransomware attack. I actually have not checked to see how that turned out, so maybe the trains are back running in Baltimore, I'm not sure. And then perhaps of most interest to this group, although may also generate the most skepticism, research finding came out that by the year 2028, it has now become highly likely, at least in the opinion of these researchers, that quantum computing will be able to defeat every single type of encryption that exists today. And of course, encryption is the foundation, or one of the foundations, of many of our types of security right now. So hopefully that will be full employment for the UCI math department to get ahead of that. So we are an interdisciplinary institute. We are a research institute, even though I personally only am qualified to do research on law and regulatory and intelligence matters. Fortunately for me, there's actually a fair amount of that happening with the California Consumer Privacy Act and the Internet of Things Privacy Act and the General Data Protection Regulation in the European Union. So a lot of our members and participants want to hear about those types of things, but I will not bore you with those tonight. If you want to talk about that afterwards, we can. I do want to announce, though, one major research finding that we were able to come to, and actually this is the first venue that I'm going to announce it. It turns out most people think, depending on your personal opinion, that the modern concept of computer hacking dates to at the oldest the time during the 70s and 80s when hackers were using their skills to spoof the long-distance telephone networks to get free long distance. And if you want to see something funny happen, I see a lot of people that are more or less in my age range here. Try to explain to any college student the concept of even having to hack the long-distance billing system, much less how it was done. But it turns out that hacking is actually much older than most people realize, based on some new anthropological findings. Geez, tough room. Okay. So the most common question I get asked everywhere I speak, and the reason for the title of this discussion, is how worried should we be about the future of cyberspace, cyber warfare, cyber attacks? And I have a perfect answer to that question. I worry the exact right amount. And the reason I know I worry the exact right amount is you actually can't worry too much about this topic, and I'm dead serious about that. I have spent a long time as a lawyer and a consultant in which I would go into companies and convince them of how great their risk is and create fear, uncertainty, and doubt so I could sell them services. That is not what this conversation is about. This conversation is about a number of what I would call strategic trends that we at our institute believe are going to converge, and in fact already are converging, to create sort of a perfect storm of cyber risk for the next decade or so. Trend number one. It has been predicted, although this is disputed, that by the year 2025 there will be 1 trillion with a T devices connected to the internet. Now, you'll recall that in 2016, only 3 years ago, many of our social media and other internet services on the east coast of the United States and the entire internet for the country of Liberia and the entire online presence of cybersecurity researcher Krebs were taken down in a distributed denial of service attack. Now, this attack was accomplished at a time when it was estimated that there were something like 35 billion, with a B, devices connected to the internet. And of course, denial of service attacks depends on how many devices you can hijack and use the power of those devices to attack a particular website or other capability to disable it. Now, I'm a lawyer, so I don't do math, but if I carry the 5, I think $1 trillion is bigger than 35 billion. So think about what was able to be accomplished in 2016 with 35 billion devices connected, and of course only a small fraction of those were used in the actual DDoS attack, versus a time when there were going to be 1 trillion devices connected to the internet. And if anything is predictable, it's that that number is probably low, because right now none of us are able to conceive of the types of devices that are going to be invented in 3 or 4 years that will increase that number. So one, within the next 10 years, you're going to have much more capability to create brute strength to use to attack components of the internet. 2, we have things like this. That's actually my screensaver. I like to keep that up on my screen to keep in mind what the mission is. And of course, Kim Jong-un is an existential threat to the United States because of his nuclear weapons and his general instability, but that's not really why he's on this slide. He is serving here as a metaphor or a standard bearer for the phenomenon that you have individuals and countries that 10 or 15 years ago would not have begun to have the capability to threaten a country such as the United States. In North Korea today, they basically still cannot get water pressure to the second floor of most of their buildings. And yet, they had the ability to bring Sony to its knees. They're in our power grid. They have capability well beyond what a country of that level of development should have. Individuals have this kind of capability. Organized terrorism and crime groups have this kind of capability. And more importantly, he's a metaphor, along with this guy, for the reality that there are just no rules out there at all. There's no restraint shown on the part of folks like this, as you probably, I'm not even going to say his name out loud in case my hard drive has been turned into a microphone. But you'll recall that his regime has assassinated numerous dissidents and foreign leaders through the use of polonium, a substance which you might as well just leave a calling card on the body that says the KGB did this. I'm sorry, I was a CIA officer for a long time in the Cold War. I still call it the KGB, the FSB, the SVR. They tried to kill 2 people on a park bench in a city in London with polonium. So the idea that this guy is going to see any limits to what he's willing and able to do, in my opinion, is ludicrous. And it's more ludicrous made more ludicrous by the fact that, as far as I can tell, neither the Obama administration or the Trump administration has done anything to send a signal to people like him that this kind of behavior is not acceptable, that breaking into political party websites in the United States and weaponizing information, that creating tens of thousands of fake bot accounts and flooding our society with propaganda is unacceptable. That, as was announced by the governor of Florida yesterday, breaking into 2 Florida state voter registration databases in 2016 is unacceptable. There is no reason for him or anyone else in the world who's copying him now to think that there's any price to be paid for doing that. Now, I'm not saying it's even possible. I haven't had a securities clearance since 2005. But I promise you, if the lights in Moscow went out for about did I say Moscow? If the lights in an unidentified foreign country went out 2 or 3 days in a row, or if a couple oligarchs lost a couple of $1 billion, that would get their attention. And that might start to tell them that if you decide that you're going to screw around with the core of American democracy, you might have some consequences. But let me take a step back from that. It pains me to say this as a career CIA officer, but this guy has pulled off the greatest intelligence operation of all time. I think there are only two in modern times that even come close. One was the successful disinformation campaign that the British and the American forces launched during World War II to convince Hitler that we were coming ashore at Calais instead of Normandy. And the other one was one that I have a lot more familiarity with, and that was the Central Intelligence Agency operation during the Reagan administration that armed the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, that arguably, you'll get historians to differ about this, but arguably caused the Soviets to have to leave Afghanistan and strongly contributed to bringing down the Soviet Union and ending the Cold War without a single shot being fired between the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, there were a few unintended consequences of that operation that came up a couple decades later, but at the time, it was a highly successful operation. But what this guy has succeeded in doing is really quite phenomenal. And if you think about it for a second, his strategic objective was not to get Trump elected president of the United States. At some point, when it became clear very late in the game that it was actually possible for Trump to win the White House, sure, they changed their operations to focus on that. But the strategic objective was and is to sow as much possible division and discord and chaos and animosity and divisiveness in the United States as they possibly could, to divide us as a country, to convince us that we really can't trust the reliability of our own elections and that we can't trust our fellow citizens, and equally important, to allow this country's diplomats to go around the world and say to other countries, you know, this whole American experiment with democracy was kind of a decent idea, worked for a while, but really, it's not working anymore. Now, if you accept that that was their strategic objective, and the Mueller report and many investigations agree with that, how could they possibly have succeeded more than they did? They were, at the same time, using cyberspace to support Black Lives Matter and to go against Black Lives Matter, to support the NRA and to go against the NRA, to support the Democrats and to support the Republicans. And for anybody who doesn't believe that, look at what happened in 2018, okay? So in 2016, yeah, at the end they supported Trump for president. In 2018, they supported Democrats that were running against conservatives in key districts. Why? Because again, they don't really care what the outcome is. They care about creating and maintaining chaos. And if you don't think they've succeeded, try to go to any dinner party that you have and have a rational conversation about the 2016 election. There have been marriages that have been broken up over the 2016 election. And furthermore, if anybody in here can name 5 substantive laws that have been passed and signed by the Congress and the President since this campaign started, I'll buy you drinks afterwards. We are completely paralyzed, we are completely frozen, and we hate each other, and that is a great intelligence operation from the standpoint of Vladimir Putin. All right, that's thing 2. Thing 1 is you have more destructive power in the hands of individuals and regimes than you ever had before. Thing 2, you have a whole rack of leaders around the world who arguably are unstable themselves, but certainly are not bound by anything that we would call the traditional rules of warfare or diplomacy or the relationship between countries. Thing 3, and I put this largely at the feet of my profession, the legal profession, there are absolutely no rules whatsoever in cyberspace. We survived destroying the world for 70 years in the Cold War, in significant part because even though we disagreed on almost everything with the Soviets and the Chinese, we agreed on the rules of nuclear deterrence. So when the Cuban Missile Crisis happened, we didn't fire nuclear missiles at each other. When Berlin happened, we didn't fire nuclear missiles at each other. When the Soviet Union took over all the countries in Eastern Europe, we didn't fire nuclear missiles at each other. When we had a shooting war between proxies of the United States and proxies of the Soviet Union in Nicaragua, we didn't blow the world up. Big part of that is because we understood what the rules were. We understood where the lines were. We understood what would cause a catastrophic reaction on the part of the other side. In the first National Strategy to Secure Cyberspace, which I was involved with, President Bush declared that the United States policy was that if there was a sufficiently significant cyber attack on the United States, we reserve the right to respond with kinetic weapons, bombs, missiles, submarines, troops, etc. China did the same. Russia did the same. In fact, Russia publicly has declared they reserve the right to respond to a cyber attack with nuclear weapons. And every single president since President Bush has reaffirmed that doctrine. Obama and Trump have both reaffirmed that doctrine. As a matter of fact, there was a general in the Air Force during the Obama administration that said publicly words to the effect that if they launch a cyber attack on us from FSB headquarters in Moscow, they better expect a projectile to come down their chimney. Now, I'm cleaning up this story for a family audience. They didn't say chimney and they didn't say projectile, but the message was pretty clear, okay? Now, if you think this is hypothetical, if you think I'm just out here creating fear and uncertainty and doubt for no reason, let me just give you two examples. One, as you may or may not be aware, there has been an economic blockade of the country of Qatar, or Qatar, depending on how you want to pronounce it, for about the last 18 months. So their fellow Arab states have prevented goods and services from coming and going from Qatar to the greatest extent they possibly could without firing shots. Now, an economic blockade in the laws of armed conflict is one step short of a military blockade, which is one step short of a shooting war. Why has this happened? Well, because the emir of the government of Qatar went on state television, completely state-controlled media, and gave a speech in which he said a whole series of things that were incredibly inflammatory to his Sunni Muslim neighbors, including supporting Israel and supporting the United States and taking the wrong side, in their view, on arguments about the split in the Muslim faith. Only problem is that speech never happened. It was what we now call a deep fake. Hackers hacked into the state television repositories and pulled clips of other statements and blended them together and made a speech that never happened, and then hacked back in and took over the servers and broadcast that speech on state-sponsored television. Enter the FBI. Now, I was a CIA officer for 15 years, so you can judge my bias about the FBI. But the government of Qatar brings in the FBI, they send their crack investigative teams over there, they investigate for about 10 days, and they announce to the world that this was an intelligence operation by the government of Russia. Well, the military imbalance between Qatar and Russia is so significant that that probably did not create an actual risk that the Qatari military was going to somehow try to take action against the Russians. But imagine if it wasn't Qatar and Russia. Imagine if it was the United States and Russia, or imagine if it was North Korea and the United States, or imagine if it was Pakistan and India. Not the end of the story. A month later, FBI comes out and says, excuse me, actually wasn't the Russian government that did it. It was hackers that happened to be physically located inside the territory of Russia that were hired and bought and paid for by the Arab neighbors, principally the United Arab Emirates of Qatar. So the entire thing was what we would have called in the CIA a covert action. It was an intelligence operation through cyberspace that led to 2 baby steps away from a shooting war. Data point number 2. This happened in the last week. Israel concluded that Hamas had launched a significant cyber attack against Israel state interests. So they concluded that they knew where the headquarters of the Hamas hacking organization was, and they dropped bombs on that building and destroyed it. Were they right? Was that hack actually launched from Hamas territory? I don't know. They, I'm sure, think they know. The Israelis are very good at this sort of thing. But you now have another example of where bombs were actually dropped, people were killed by something that happened in cyberspace. And as you all know, it is extremely easy to spoof your location, your capabilities, and your motivations, and the people that are behind you in cyberspace. So we're now again in this world where there is a great degree of uncertainty, even in being able to determine the facts of what happened in any particular instance, much less the legal standards. And this is where we lawyers have fallen short. There's no agreement at all about how much damage caused by a cyber attack is enough to warrant, under the laws of armed conflict, a kinetic response or a crippling cyber response by another country. And in my opinion, this is exceedingly dangerous, because suppose, for example, North Korea thinks that the threshold for when the United States is going to respond with military force is here, but we believe it's here. Okay? If they do something in this zone in between where they think we're going to respond and where we think we're going to respond, you could easily have a shooting war start when nobody intended it to start. And you know, that's happened a few times before in history and hasn't turned out all that well. So I don't see that changing anytime soon, by the way. There is an international cyber treaty, which everyone except the countries that count have signed, the United States, China, and Russia, and it will never get signed by the United States, China, and Russia. Why? Because we don't agree on the fundamental principles of what should govern cyberspace. For example, Russia and China believe that they should have the absolute right under international law to completely shut down communications in and out of their country or modify it any way they see fit. And as a matter of fact, the Russian Duma, the parliament, just passed a law in the last couple months that requires Putin's government, what the hell, the cat's out of the bag, Putin's government to create an entirely separate internet for Russia that is not connected to the outside world. I don't think that's actually going to fly, because I think they're going to realize pretty soon that Russians like to buy things from people in the outside world. But in theory, not in theory, that is their plan, that is their intent. And in many countries, censorship is a key part of what they think is legitimate cyber doctrine. So we're never going to agree on this stuff. We're never going to agree on what the rules are. And fourth and finally, in this parade of horribles that I think add up to an incredibly dangerous threat environment over the next 10 years or so, is that our government, and I'm speaking specifically about the United States government, but I think it's generally true of most governments in the West, is unable and or unwilling to protect us from these types of attacks. Again, as far as I can tell, neither Obama or Trump have done anything to convince Putin and his ilk that there's any consequence for doing the kinds of attacks on our democratic system that they've been launching, much less breaking into our power grid, stealing our intellectual property. The Director of National Intelligence has recently said that the last 20 years have been the greatest single transfer of wealth in human history from the United States to the People's Republic of China. There's no deterrent against that. Do we as a United States military and intelligence community have the technical tools to be able to launch our own offensive cyber attacks? Of course we do. Widely rumored that we and the Israelis were behind the Stuxnet attack on the Iranian centrifuges that arguably set the Iranian nuclear program back about 10 years. How do we know that this happened? We know because the code that supposedly was written to be able to attack one and only one type of mechanical device in the world, that is the specific type of centrifuges that were in the Nanans plant in Iran, got out. Supposedly, it was aimed at air-gapped systems that were not connected to the internet. And if you believe the rumors, it was accomplished by a human asset, a human agent, somehow getting a thumb drive into that facility and into those centrifuges that infected that plant. But the reason the world knows about this at all is because the code was found in industrial systems in the northeast part of the United States. I have never seen an explanation to this minute as to how it got from a supposed air-gapped system in Iran with a technology that was targeted to only be able to affect one type of machinery out into the wild and affecting other systems. But this entire set of unintended consequences is out there, and it's going to continue. Most of the tools that were used to launch the Petya, not Petya attacks a couple of years ago that devastated systems around the world supposedly were stolen from the United States National Security Agency. Well, that's a massive intelligence failure in two ways. One is now we can't use those tools anymore, and everyone else can. And again, our government, as far as I can tell, is either incapable or unwilling to do anything about it. So if we have the tools, why aren't we doing anything about it? Well, there's a couple reasons. One is it's actually exceedingly dangerous. As they found out with Stuxnet, this stuff does get out. We've been debating offensive cyber operations for as long as I was in government, and the problem, one of the many problems, is that it's very difficult to contain these things once you aim them at a target, and particularly in the financial system. So I sort of jokingly said earlier, maybe we should just make a couple $1 billion disappear out of a couple oligarchs' accounts, and that would deter Putin. Probably would. But there's a very significant chance we would also remove a couple $1 billion from other accounts that we don't want to attack, including those in the United States, because of the interconnectedness of the international banking system. And you have absolutely no political agreement in Washington about the morality and the efficacy and the legality of using these kind of tools. There's an entire lobby, and I've worked with these groups, the American Civil Liberties Union, the Center for Democracy and Technology, Electronic Frontier Foundation, et cetera, who argue that these sorts of tools cannot and should not ever be used because they're too dangerous to privacy and civil liberties. And they have a point. There are issues there. But we are now in this situation where particularly American companies, but multinational companies around the world, and some individuals, are being attacked by governments, by nation states, as though they were nation states. And I know what I'm talking about, because my law firm represents Fusion GPS, the group that created the dossier on Trump, the infamous dossier. And the minute, and I mean the minute, within minutes of when it became publicly known that we represented that client, our attacks on our cyber systems at our law firm spiked like that because Russia came after us. Our government's not doing anything about it. We have so far successfully resisted those things because we know what we're doing and because we hired companies to help us. But that is essentially a foreign government waging war on an American institution because they don't like what we're doing and they don't like what our government's doing. And not to be selfish about it, look at what happened to Sony, right? So 2014, Sony, a private company, an entertainment company of all things, not a company that makes bombs or missiles or cyber warfare gear or even is critical to the economy, a movie company, a movie production company, gets attacked by the full force of the government of North Korea because they were about to put out a movie that was embarrassing to the dear leader. This activity by North Korea, and I was just an expert witness in a big international arbitration in Vancouver about this case, this had all the hallmarks of traditionally what a country would do to another country if they were going to war with them. First of all, it was a massive espionage operation. They broke in, they copied all of the most sensitive documents and materials of Sony and all their executives and all their consultants and all their employees and all their third-party vendors. Then they conducted what, if it was a government to government, we would call diplomacy, but in this case you could call extortion, which is they said, if you release this movie, we're going to rain holy hell down on you. We're going to release all the embarrassing emails that your executives wrote about President Obama and about various movie stars. We're going to lock up all your data. We're going to steal all your healthcare information, and we're going to destroy your company. And then, when Sony did not sufficiently cave in, although they caved in a lot, the North Koreans released all that data to the extent that it was so damaging that the litigation I was involved in was the result of the fact that within a month, Sony had burned through all $60 million of their cyber insurance, and they were trying to find other ways to pay to repair the damage. Now, under the laws of armed conflict, this was probably a sufficient activity on the part of the North Korean government to constitute an act of war. But it was committed not against the U.S. Army or the U.S. Navy or the U.S. Marine Corps or the White House or the State Department or the Capitol, but a private company. I submit to you that we have not been in this kind of a situation for about 600 years, where the vast majority of the critical infrastructure to defend the national and economic security of the country is vulnerable to foreign attack, but is entirely controlled by the private sector. You almost have to think back to the days of sort of the East India Trading Company or the Dutch Trading Company, where the British and the Dutch governments, as powerful as they were, did not have the reach to protect their citizens and their interests all around the world. So they basically deputized these private companies to go out with arms and wage war on behalf of the country. Why? Because they really had no alternative. And by the way, don't tell anyone, because this is my secret screenplay idea, but there is a provision of the United States Constitution that authorizes the President and Congress to issue what are called letters of marque and reprisal. Who's heard of these things? Okay. So for those of you who don't know, letter of marque is essentially a presidential order that authorizes a private company, in the old days turning pirates into privateers, to go out and offensively attack the economic interests of another country who was our enemy. And the way this would work is you go find Blackbeard, and yesterday he was a criminal who could be hanged on sight, or I guess you can't hang him on sight, but once you capture him, into a privateer who is fighting on behalf of your country. A letter of reprisal is the opposite end of that equation. The Spanish or the British navies attack the U.S., and we now authorize private tiers, pirates turned into privateers, to go and take revenge. And what's in it for them? What's in it for them is they get to keep a certain percentage of the booty, the money and treasure that they steal from those ships. Well, guess what? Those two provisions of the Constitution have never been repealed, and they can be carried out in secret. So I would not be surprised if sometime in the next decade, our government decides that we need to privatize, we need to turn private hackers into privateers to go out and do the things that we're unable or unwilling to do. And again, if you think that's hypothetical, that's exactly what Russia and China do now. China, the Chinese People's Republic Army Intelligence Services, military intelligence services, have tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of hackers that work for them. But that's not the bulk of what they do. The bulk of what they do is they incentivize their citizens to go out and do this for them. They publish lists of targets, and so do the Russians. And probably that attack on the government of Qatar appeared somewhere on those target lists. Now, is that because to make the FBI run a third time, which I love to do, this is actually what the government of Russia intended? Or is it just because some corrupt official in the middle of the intelligence bureaucracy of Russia decided they were going to make some money by getting the government of UAE to pay them to do this? Who knows? Probably doesn't really matter. The point is, governments all around the world are privatizing cyber offensive operations, and it would not surprise me if we did that probably in the next day. Now, for any of you guys who run companies or chief information security officers, I can't be your lawyer because you haven't hired me, but I will tell you this. Any offensive cyber operations carried out by a private citizen or a private company in the United States today are federal felonies. Under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, if you so much as put a few bytes of code into a sensitive document that when they get stolen and taken to Beijing, the code simply phones home and tells you where your data is, you have committed a federal felony. much less anything that would create a capability for the document to self-destruct or to damage the system of the individual or company or country who'd taken it. That is going to change. There are a number of bills in the United States Congress right now that will give companies more authority to defend themselves in cyberspace without violating this law. Why? Because it's just going to have to happen. Microsoft, already doing it. But the way they do it is they go to a U.S. federal judge. It's actually quite brilliant. They go to a U.S. federal judge and they say, Judge, we are suing APT28, which is a code name for one of the Russian hacking groups, or maybe it's Chinese, I can't keep them straight. They say, these guys are taking over Microsoft systems. They're using them to launch cyber attacks on people. They're stealing information, making it look like the Microsoft systems are doing that. So they are violating not only our customers' rights, but they're damaging our reputation, and they're violating our rights. So guess what, Judge? We want to file a lawsuit against these guys, and we want to get damages from them, knowing full well the day they walk into court to file the lawsuit that they're never getting APT28 into a U.S. court. They don't care. What they want the judge to do next is to issue an order to the domain name service company to take all the traffic that's going back and forth from the command and control server of the bad guys and redirect it into a honeypot account, a fake account sitting on servers in Redmond, Washington. And then what they do is now they've severed the connection between the bad guys' ability to control all these robots that are sitting on computers all over the world handling these attacks, and they're able to not only learn everything about them, because now all this traffic's getting routed into a Microsoft server, but they're able to launch code into all those boxes around the world to shut that down. Now we're talking about potentially, in some of these cases, tens of millions of private computers and servers and Internet of Things devices that the owners have no idea have been taken over and used for this purpose. So we are actually, from Redmond, Washington, launching our own malicious code into tens of millions of computers around the world. By the way, many of them inside the United States, probably. I say probably because really they don't know who they're hitting. Why isn't every Microsoft executive in prison? Because they got a federal judge to issue a warrant that authorized them to do that. Is that constitutional? Do our courts really have the power to do that? I'm not sure they do. But it's been done so many times now that it's become basically the law that you can get away with that. And Microsoft has been very successful at it. They've defended their intellectual property, they've defended their customers, they've defended their reputation. But not every company, not most companies have the ability to go into the resources to go into a court and get these orders on a regular basis. So I predict in the next 10 years, there's going to be more authority on the part of companies to go do this. Now, if you're the general counsel or you're the chairman of a company, even if it's legal, do you want to do it? Well, there's a couple problems. One is, you're going to put yourselves high on the radar screen of the foreign governments that are doing these attacks, and maybe you don't want to put yourself in the crosshairs of those governments. And two, there's a problem of liability, because you're not always going to hit the right target. That's another problem that feeds into this whole mix, is it's very, very difficult to reliably and accurately determine the location of the target that you're trying to hit. And any good hacker group is going to use false flag operations. They're gonna, if they're Russian, they're gonna try to convince you that they're in China. One of the most famous early cyber attacks on the US government was actually launched on the Department of Defense in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and it was launched from the Harvard University Library. Now, no one actually thinks there were a bunch of Harvard University students in the library that launched this attack, but the bad guys who actually did it, almost certainly was Russia, Soviet Union at the time, went through that library as a proxy because they knew that the US government would have a very difficult time doing anything against a university library. So if you're a private company and you even get this legal authority and you're starting to think about doing things, you got to think about your liability if you launch an attack and hit the wrong target. Or if you even get accused of hitting the wrong target, and all of a sudden now you got to go into court and prove that you didn't. So we have a massive number of devices that can cause all kinds of damage if they're taken over. And by the way, that's putting aside all the direct damage of these devices being taken over. So you got a Nest thermometer in your house, the same type of malicious attack that can take over that device, or your smart refrigerator, or your smart TV, or God forbid, if you have Alexa, or any other equivalent, not to just pick on Amazon. The same code, the same attack vectors, the same spear phishing attack, the same flaws in your software that allow those devices to be taken over to launch attacks on other people also allow the bad guys to get all your personal and private information off your network and get and take control over devices and systems inside your house. I'm not going to put people on the spot. Nobody has to raise their hand and tell me that if they have Alexa or not, or they have the Google device or not. But if you do, I bet none of you, or very few of you, have gone in and changed any of the default settings in those devices. And typically the defaults are that the username is admin and the password is password. And there are already hundreds of millions of these devices out there in the wild with virtually no security. And it's not, in some cases, it's not just they decide not to set security as the default, it's that they cannot secure them. Why? Because some of these Internet of Things devices are so small and have so little code and memory in them that you can't even build in encryption, you can't even build in security. And they're out there, and it's very expensive and very difficult to go and retrofit security onto these devices after they're already out in the wild. So that's thing one. As I said before, thing two, you got guys like this, you got guys like Kim Jong-un who don't care, have no rules, unrestricted, and they have the capacity and the willingness to mess around with us in multiple different ways. You have the fact that there's no rules that are agreed on, and you have the fact that governments are unwilling and unable to do much about it, and you have the fact that there's lots of peril in any approach that can be taken by the private sector to protect ourselves. So, this is the kind of situation that we're in. This is an oldie-timey map, obviously, of the Caribbean. Many of these maps will have a legend written on them that says something to the effect of, "Here there be monsters." The reason why I don't have one up there is because I can't find one that's not copyright protected. So if anybody knows of one, let me know. Now, my theory is this. I don't think that the government map makers who made these maps back in the 16th century, 17th century, actually thought there was a giant sea monster of that proportion in the Caribbean. I think what they were trying to tell the sailors who got their hands on these maps and used them was, if you sail into these waters, we don't know what's out there, and we're not going to have any ability to protect you, and you go at your own risk. And unfortunately, that's where we are in cyberspace now. So now that I've become an academic, I don't actually have to solve any problems, I just have to identify them. So are we out of time? No. However, at our institute and at UCI, we are doing a number of things to try to address these problems. And the principal thing is we've launched a major research initiative that is trying to identify gaps in the security in the Internet of Everything. So traditional Internet, computers, servers, websites, social media, Internet of Things, all these devices that are connected to the Internet. Internet of Everything is when the devices talk to the traditional Internet components. And finally, very late in the game, a lot of vertical sectors of the US economy and others are starting to pay attention to security with regard to these devices. But it is almost all siloed. So, for example, Southern California Edison is now doing a lot of work to try to figure out how to secure the Internet of Things devices on the power grid and things like the Nest thermometers that go in homes. And Verizon is trying to secure the 5G network, and medical device companies are trying to secure medical devices, and car companies are trying to secure the average of 100 Internet connection points that are in a modern automobile. But there is almost no effort that we can find that's being directed at how do you secure the seams of all these connections, right? So, great example is for any of you who've tried to actually set up a home network of devices. Typically, if you do Samsung as your base technology, let's say, you have to buy a Samsung router that's separate from your regular router to have these devices talk to each other. And then, if the devices need to talk to the internet as opposed to just to each other, which they all do, there has to be a way for those devices to communicate with each other and communicate with the internet, and that typically involves the ability for your device router to talk to your internet router that's in your house. But guess what? Most times those are going to have entirely different security protocols that are very difficult to set up securely so they work together. So what do most people do? They set them up non-securely. Well, you could probably get a pretty big positive effect on the security of the country if you came up with a solution for how to make those two sets of routers easily talk to each other without sacrificing security. Don't know if that's something we're going to work on, but that's the kind of thing we're working on. And we secured funding to set up an Internet of Things test range on the UCI campus. We are running a project to work with the State Attorney General's office to have better and more effective regulations around the California Consumer Privacy Act and the Internet of Things Privacy Act, so that we are able to require companies that want to put this technology into California to have better security, but not have regulations that are so ridiculous or strict or static that nobody's going to be able to comply with them. And the third thing we're doing under this project is we're working with insurance companies, because the weird thing that's happening in the United States is, in the absence of federal government comprehensive regulation of cybersecurity, the insurance companies are becoming the de facto regulators. So if you go try to get a cyber insurance policy, if it's a good one, not a junk policy, chances are that your insurance company is going to say, okay, either we're not going to cover you unless you do these 15 things, or we'll give you a discount if you do these 15 things. So that is, in my opinion, as much as, I hate insurance companies as much as the next guy, that is actually a positive development. The problem is they have no idea what they're doing. Anybody in insurance here? Too late to ask. They're well-intentioned, but there's no actuarial data really on cyber attacks, not like with credit card fraud or auto accidents or liver cancer, where you can actually get mathematicians to calculate the likelihood of a claim. The whole cyber attack world is too new, and there have been too few successful big legal cases, so they just don't have the data to figure out how to price their products based on that. So they're just kind of making up as they go along. And is that better than nothing? Maybe, but what really needs to happen is you need to have some sort of well-informed, universally accepted standards, so that through the insurance process we start to get to the point where a significant percentage, a critical mass of systems in the United States are secured to an acceptable level. Why is that important? Well, as I was thinking through the historical analogies for how to talk about this problem, in addition to the East India Trading Company and the oldie-timey maps, and by the way, obviously we're hoping this doesn't happen. The best analogy that I was able to come up with for where I think we are right now is this. And most of you will probably recognize that as a photograph of the British Army being evacuated from the beaches at Dunkirk in World War II. And for those of you who don't know the story, I didn't see the movie, the Spielberg movie, well, I guess it wasn't, was it? Anyway, the movie of a couple of years ago. 400,000 British troops in early days of World War II were trapped on the beaches of Europe at Dunkirk under the attack of the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, and with, I don't know, 1 million German troops closing in on them. And almost certainly they would have been completely destroyed. And it's obviously hypothetical, but had the British Army been completely destroyed in Europe early on in World War II, we might be speaking German right now. So almost the entire army was evacuated off that beach under enemy fire, not by the British Navy, but by thousands and thousands of sailboats and powerboats and yachts that weren't drafted into service by the British government. The British government simply said, go get our guys. And they did. thousands and thousands of civilians drove their little boats into enemy fire, into the strongest air force in the world, to pull those troops off the beaches. And I think that's kind of where we are. In the absence of any regulation, in the absence of any agreement on standards, in the absence of any rationality on the part of those who would attack us, in the absence of our government's ability to protect us, I think there's a significant chance that our economic and national security will depend in significant part on the actions of every chief information security officer in every company, of personal computer owners at home, of the companies that manufacture Internet of Things devices, to make the incremental changes and improvements in security at the local level, and I'm talking very local, like on your phone, on your computer, on your company systems, that in aggregate reduce the attack surface that foreign adversaries can use to attack us. And so I often give this talk to groups of information security professionals, and I often end it in a very melodramatic, schmaltzy way, but I actually believe this. I say to them, during those days when you're working 18 hours and you haven't had a day off in months and your boss won't give you the money you need to secure your systems, and you feel like you have a thankless job because they never recognize the thousands of days that go by without a successful attack, they only fire you when there's a successful one. Think about this. If you do your part at your local level, you might just save the world. Thanks. I'll take questions. If we have time. Do we have time?
Yeah, we do. So traditionally, our first question goes to Windsor on behalf of the IEEE Computer Society.
Yeah, good afternoon. Good evening, actually. The Computer Society gets remuneration from IEEE for the IEEE members who attend meetings we sponsor or co-sponsor, so I'd like to see by a show of hands, how many of you are IEEE members? Yes, thank you.
Okay. Before we release the questions, I just wanted to mention that right after we announced this talk by Bryan, we had a spike in membership in our meetup group, and some of these members looked a little suspicious to me, so I kicked one out of the group, and there was a letter or an email from the meetup.org, which I was copied on, to this individual, and it said that the organizer of your meetup group has dismissed you from the group, but there are plenty of meetup groups in Moscow that might be. Now I know why. So, again, floor is open for questions.
Sir.
So in the beginning, they gave us the public Wi-Fi password and logins. Was that a test or a trap?
And you talking about in this meeting?
Yeah.
Well, I'm not saying I have any listening devices on me that captured all those passwords. I don't know. I wasn't here. Sir.
You alluded to some action the Trump administration took, and it has to do with 5G, and of course the Internet of Things that you were talking about is going to be going crazy with 5G because of all the throughput, speed of 5G. And currently in the United States, almost all of the net providers, AT&T, T-Mobile, Verizon, Sprint, all the majors have contracted with Ericsson to do their 5G. And the administration has been concerned about China and their influence over their companies, and even if the company says, oh, well, we'll tell you that we won't do this, but of course, in the Chinese law it says they can do it. What's your take on that?
So my understanding of what the president actually did today is there's a law called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, and that authorizes a president to issue an executive order that says, I'm declaring an emergency in X, and in this case, X was the development of the 5G telecommunications system in the United States. And I, based on intelligence and law enforcement information, have concluded that there are certain entities that cannot be allowed to participate in that because it would create an unacceptable emergency risk. And the President and the Treasury Department can then name individual people and individual companies that essentially are banned. And what that means is, and if Verizon or Sprint or any of the other telecom providers or AT&T do business with Huawei or DTE, I think they're the first two named. I don't think Ericsson's actually named yet.
No, because Ericsson's one of the accepted ones that it's okay.
Right. So we can levy very heavy penalties on the American companies that do business with the foreign companies. So question seems to me is there a rational basis for drawing a line between Huawei and DTE on the one hand and Ericsson on the other hand? And to me that goes to two things. One is, Ericsson's German or Swiss? Swedish, right.
Sure, you bet, shot.
Right. So yeah. So it doesn't make sense for us to trust a Swedish company if we don't trust a Russian or a Chinese company. And I'll just tell you a quick little story about that. So back when I was a serving intelligence officer, if you went to five-star hotel, not just in China and Russia, but in France in particular, and in the UK and in Germany, this is how old I am, they would do you this great courtesy of providing you an in-room shredding machine. So you roll into your suite, there's a shredding machine that's attached to the wall, and it's free, and you can shred all your sensitive documents. Well, those things were actually photocopiers. Imagine the diabolical genius of that, right? You are self-selecting the most sensitive documents that it would have taken some agent to break into your apartment and search for hours. So I in no way, shape, or form accept the notion that because they're Swedish and not Chinese, we have nothing to worry about. And more importantly, and I think maybe to your point, isn't it possible that the Chinese, in this case, have also infiltrated Ericsson either through malicious insiders or through technology and are able to accomplish the same thing? And the answer, of course, to that is yes. And it's going to be up to the intelligence services and the Treasury Department to decide if Ericsson is a significant enough risk to ban them too. And if they do, can you go and extract what they've already done from the system? I'm not confident of that, so therefore I'm not confident of how well this will work, but I am confident that we're better off banning Huawei and DTE than not. Sir?
I have two questions. Number one is, do you think this problem is going to get worse with the cryptocurrency, and do you see basically blockchain might be a solution, potential solution for us?
Well, so two things about that. One is, I think it was Forbes or the Wall Street Journal did a study a couple of years ago of like a 2 or 3 month period where they tracked the change in the traded value of a company if they added the word blockchain to their name. And it was a straight up spike. So, in some sense, blockchain, I think, is just the kind of next shiny object, although now it's probably even more moved into AI and machine learning. But the second data point is we actually did a big conference at our institute 2 years ago on what potential was there of blockchain technology to secure the supply chain. So this exact question. And two things about that. One is the keynote speaker was the highest civilian official in the United States Department of Defense responsible for supply chain security. And she said, and this was not broadcast, but it was a public event, she said that up to 30% of all electronic equipment on U.S. naval ships deployed around the world right now are counterfeit. And furthermore, we know they're counterfeit when we buy them. Why? Because the systems on those ships are so old that the original equipment manufacturers no longer exist and they can't fabricate the replacement parts. So we knowingly, as a government, take the risk of putting these counterfeit parts on our ships because we have no alternative. So I actually think blockchain has some potential, but here's the thing there's all kinds of things about blockchain. One is, it's not all that secure yet. Two, there's a big question about how you're going to do the incentive structure to make a blockchain network work, except for in cryptocurrency. There's a reason why it's been successful with Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, and that is that and I'll quickly get beyond my understanding, and I'm sure there's mathematicians here, but my understanding is what makes the whole system work is you incentivize individual miners to solve complex math problems in order to validate that the link can be put in the blockchain. My question has always been, the minute you get outside of a cryptocurrency environment where you can pay the miners in Bitcoin, what's the incentive for anybody to do that work? I don't know the answer to that. The other issue with blockchain and supply chain specifically is all blockchain does is it creates multiple copies of immutable records of a transaction, which is very valuable, but you have to have a transaction to record, right? So let's say you wanted to deploy blockchain tomorrow to secure smart TVs around the world. Well, you would have to deploy some kind of a sensor at the manufacturing factory, on every container that the equipment's on every truck it's on every train it's on every ship it's on, so that there's something to record, right? So you might say, well, I'm confident that it would take 25 minutes for somebody to break into a container ship, break into a TV, and change a part. Well, now I need a sensor on the door of that ship that alerts me every time 26 minutes goes by. Who's going to deploy all those sensors? Who's going to build them? Who's going to put them? So I'm skeptical about blockchain being a short-term solution to much of anything outside of the financial arena. I think eventually it could be really good, but I don't think we're anywhere close to there yet.
The second question I have is, you mentioned that basically Russia plays both sides, throws people at each other and so on. So if this is so well known within, intelligence community and so on, and that information is available to our government, members at various levels and so on. I understand if public goes at each other, but why the government doesn't understand that? Why they don't at least admit that and think twice before they do things?
Well, so I think it's important to understand the Russian operations on four different fronts. One, actually breaking into voting machines and databases and changing votes. And on that, I'm not too worried. We actually ran a conference last year, which is on C-SPAN. If you guys can become the 10th and 11th and 12th people to watch it if you're up late at night, on election hacking. And the reason I'm not terribly worried about actually changing votes electronically is because our system is so completely decentralized that you'd have to deploy so many. Voting machines are easily hackable. Cylance and everybody else has demonstrated that. But you got to do it at a retail level. You can't sit there from Moscow and broadcast a signal and change a lot of votes. You got to send people into the voting precincts. And as we learned in 2016, not so easy to know which precincts to send people to in advance to change the result of an election. So they're trying that, but I'm not too worried about that. The second thing is violating the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which of course they don't care about, breaking into databases, stealing secret information, and publishing it. This is what they did to the DNC. This is what they did to John Podesta. And by the way, you can search the 438 or whatever it is pages of the Mueller report, and you can watch, an hour of Fox News and then an hour of MSNBC, and after your head explodes, you can conclude that not a word, there's no evidence that a word of any of those emails that the Russians stole and put out through WikiLeaks were fake. So these were not propaganda in the traditional intelligence sense. These were exposing things that the Clinton campaign and the DNC did not want exposed publicly, like the fact that the DNC helped to rig the primary system to get Sanders defeated. So it was illegal for sure. We hate the idea that a foreign government is interfering in our election, but it really wasn't. There's nothing our government could have done about that. And finally, most importantly, the most effective weapon in their entire operations, I think, were these phony social media postings by the tens of thousands that were on all sides of all issues. And by the way, they're still doing it today. I think Facebook took down 200 sites or 200 botnets last week. The reason the government can't do anything about that is the First Amendment. The government cannot come in and regulate that kind of speech legally in the United States. Facebook can, Twitter can, the social media companies can, and they are, I think, doing a little bit better job about that than they did in 2016, but there's a problem there too, right? Does anyone want Mark Zuckerberg being the speech police for the entire world? You know, or any human being for that matter, but certainly not that guy. So there is, in my opinion, one and only one remedy to that problem, and that is, again, not to sound too naive or patriotic, but voters have to pay attention to the accuracy of the crap they read. I mean, if you had looked at 5 sources of news instead of just the feed that already agrees with your political views, you might be a little skeptical about some of the crap that was being put out. But people don't do that anymore. I mean, I sound like a grumpy old man, but you know, I say this to people all the time. I've appeared on Fox and MSNBC and CNN and Wall Street Journal and The Nation magazine, all over the place. You go and watch an hour, as I said, of Fox News at night, and an hour of MSNBC at night, and after your head explodes, you will come away realizing that these are not news programs. These are straight up propaganda operations, and on both sides, and they're the same. Like Fox, in my view, is not worse than MSNBC, MSNBC is not worse than Fox. But because we pick and choose to watch and read only things that we already agree with, we're much more susceptible to being tricked than we used to be, and at some point, that's on us. You know, the government can't do anything about that. My fault with the government of Obama and Trump is we have not taken actions to deter the Russians and the Chinese and others from doing this stuff to us. And that you could do without violating the First Amendment. Sir.
Follow up. I believe it was Florida within the last week announced that their voting rolls
Yep.
back.
Yesterday, the governor.
Okay. Would the Russians' best bet be to go in and randomly delete voters from the voter roll? Create chaos that way? How would you feel if you showed up with your folder with your name on it at your polling place and they said, sorry?
Yeah, and I would submit that we had this debate a few years ago about the ability of a foreign adversary to fatally damage the U.S. financial system. And people would argue, well, you know, it's too big, it's too complicated, nobody can really do that much. And my argument is you don't have to really damage it, you just have to create uncertainty. And you can create uncertainty by making the balance not quite come out a couple times a month. So I agree with you, if we get to 10 a.m. on Election Day 2020, and you have lots of credible stories being run on television that show that voters who bothered to show up at the polls were turned away because their names were on the list, that's going to create a cascading effect where thousands or tens of thousands of other people aren't going to show up. And I'll tell you something else. We had a conference yesterday at our institute, which is going to be, if you go to our website, we're going to put all the video up in a week or so ago. And one of the Internet of Things attacks that was demonstrated is the ability to change traffic signals. Seems like it's just a nuisance, but what if a foreign adversary decides that there's a precinct that they don't want people to vote in, and they just jam up all the traffic within 10 blocks of there? That's a problem. So again, I want to be very careful about what I said. I don't think in the near term an adversary has the ability to actually go in and change a Trump vote to a Kamala Harris vote or vice versa, but I'm not sure they have to do that to cause a lot of problems. What if you just disrupted the transmission of the election results from the polling places to the state, Secretary of State to the media? That's going to cause a lot of its own kind of chaos. There are going to be a lot of people who, if you do that at 4 in the afternoon, are going to say, screw it, this whole process is illegitimate, I'm not going to go vote. And again, that's exactly what the Russians want. They want to prove that our system doesn't work. So I can't give you any happiness on that point. You're right, it's a problem. Here, then here.
I actually came from the country that you were showing some pictures from. And I lived in this totalitarian regime, and I think some of my former compatriots probably a little bit more sensitive to understanding where, that nature of those secret services and secret organizations that control your life and can, wreak havoc on your personal life and your social life and whatever. But I'm just really curious how that happened, that from the DARPA project, which was basically a defense project, to protect the United States and build a resilient and a sustainable, survivable system, we actually got to the system that actually potentially destroys and explodes the society. Where was that point? And by the way, I think DARPA completely gave control of the internet to non-government international agency with rules and checks and balances really unknown and unpredictable potentially. So I'm really curious, where was that point, and when do you think was that point when that control and ability to actually, you know, with the United States being really like the leader of the free world, at least that's the concepts of my generations, how we were growing up and feeling that and seeing it, but then it became that basically given a free rein and passed on to something that turned basically against that free world and free democracy and at least that minded countries and that minded people.
Well, first of all, I blame Al Gore. I'm kidding. I do blame him, but I'm kidding. I think there's a lot of answers to that question, but I'll put two out there to think about. One is a technical answer, which is that as my understanding is when ARPANET was created, it never remotely occurred to the people creating it that it would ever become a tool for civilian communication. That the intention of it, just as you said, was that it would be a government network that would survive a nuclear attack. And so if that's your guiding philosophy, then you're going to be much more about speed and efficacy and survivability and robustness than you are security. And particularly in those days when the bandwidth was so low, the cost in terms of efficiency of building in things like serious encryption I think would have been extremely high. So I think we at no point did anyone think, oh, now we better worry about security. And by the way, we're still making the exact same mistake today. So 10 years ago or so, people concluded, gee, wasn't it stupid that we built this whole internet for efficiency and nobody thought about security because it's so much harder and more expensive and more difficult to retrofit security onto a network like that. But we're doing the same thing with IoT, exactly the same thing. These companies, they want to get the product out to market, they want it to be fast, they want it to be efficient, they don't want to hassle the customer, so they ignore security, and now we're in the same boat there. So that's sort of the technical, my view of the technical answer. The, I think, much more important answer is we're just idiots. I mean, it's like I said before, the Soviet Union and Russia before the Soviet Union have been trying to do this stuff for more than 100 years. In the 1968 campaign, the Soviet ambassador was sent to the Hubert Humphrey campaign headquarters literally with a paper bag of cash. $100,000, and said, Moscow tells me that we will do anything to help you win the election. Except the difference between 1968 and 2016 is the Humphrey campaign told them to get lost, and they could enforce that because the only real way you could cause a complete control of an election was with money. Now, they're still doing the same kind of operations, and by the way, I have to say, footnote as a CIA officer, it's not like we've never done that. It's not like we've never messed around in anyone else's election. It's just this guy is better at it than we were. And part of the reason he's better at it, and the main point I want to make is that, again, we as voters and citizens, and this is way outside the Cybersecurity Institute, so take it for what it's worth, but we have become so polarized and so only willing to listen to arguments that we already agree with, that it's made the job of a foreign propaganda operation so much easier than it ever was before. And the only solution to that, I think, is for us to wake up and pay more attention to what we're doing. I will give one glimmer of hope, though. I think we're pretty close to out of time. It's a little complicated, but part of the reason why our Congress is completely dysfunctional, and you can get, I don't want to get too political, but I don't think Trump is the disease. I think he's a symptom of the disease. The only way that somebody with Trump's publicly stated views gets elected is that we're so retreated into our own corners that it just becomes a question of who can get more of their voters out at the right time in the election. And the reason for that is gerrymandering. And gerrymandering is a legal activity, not an illegal activity, that state legislatures carry out where they get to draw the boundaries of congressional districts in the United States. And this is entirely under the control, in our case, of the California state legislature. And so what the Democrats and the Republicans have turned into a science is drawing these districts in such a way that only Democrats can get elected out of one district and only Republicans can get elected out of another district. And what that does is it means that the only competition that you have, if you want to be a Republican congressman from southern Arizona, is the only way you're going to lose is if somebody on the right runs against you in a primary and beats you. And the only way a Democrat in the Bronx is going to lose is if somebody on the left runs against them and defeats them. And what that does is it means that the most extreme people on both sides get sent to Congress. And now we're surprised that we can't agree on anything. The reason I say there's a glimmer of hope, the United States Supreme Court has taken a case this term, with the announcement of the decision of which will come out in October, that may make the process of gerrymandering illegal. And if we got back to the point where Democrats and Republicans had to compete for the center in these districts, I think we would become a lot less polarized. But maybe we won't survive as a republic long enough for that to work. Sir.
Do you watch Game of Thrones?
Yeah.
Wait, here, like, yes or no?
I do.
Okay, don't tell me what happened in the recent episode. I haven't seen it yet, please, so don't tell me whatever.
Okay.
I feel like the Night's Watch in like the early seasons. Every time I go home, I sound like a regular lunatic. I'm starting to lose friends, and as introverts, it's quite cool, but like, it's kind of frustrating to try to explain to people this kind of stuff. I don't know what to do. I mean, how does your family put up with you?
Well, okay, I will not reveal that a dire wolf is now sitting on the Iron Throne. Yeah, I mean, you know, I sometimes sound paranoid, but in the words of Woody Allen, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean everyone's not out to get you. That it?
That's a very appropriate way to end this.
Thanks, everyone. Oh, I'm so sorry. One more thing. I'm going to leave some of these flyers on the table there. I don't know if how many of you guys work for companies, but our institute, along with the state of California and the U.S. Commercial Service, are sponsoring a cybersecurity trade mission to Singapore and Malaysia in the fall. And it's actually a really great thing. So a small California company, you got to go on our website and apply, but if you get selected, you can pay $1,500 and spend a week in Singapore and Malaysia, and the U.S. government will arrange meetings with government agencies and companies over there to sell California-based cybersecurity-related goods and services. So take a look and go on our website if you want to sign up. Thanks.
I'd like to give you this small token of our appreciation from the ACM for speaking to us.
Great.
Yeah, that to all of your other accolades.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.